I wonder whether both of you as speakers have given enough attention to the gradual evolution of Maori notions. Maybe the absence of the word rangatiratanga is because kingitanga is a really important phase of Maori grasping of the need that in the face of a British crown, they had to create some kind of central authority. I mean, in Tamahana's vision of kingitanga, surely he sees kingitanga as a kind of centre point of not just at the ground level, but it was a structural authority that Māori would need in order to survive. Now, I know that doesn't last, and I know that the kotahitanga movements later try to find some other basis, but it's a very interesting moment in the 1860s, close enough to 1840s, in fact commenting on what had happened in the earlier phase.
Just a couple of thoughts in response to that. Thank you, Peter. Well, one point I was going to make clearer, perhaps in my kōrero, was how the searching for these new forms of Māori constitutionalism is, in a sense, it's a response to being shut out of the emerging, settler colonial order out of the settler parliament and so on, and that fateful visit of Tamihana to Auckland in 1855 or whatever it was, where he tries to meet Gore Brown, possibly to, I think Michael said this to me, to get some sort of authorisation for a Māori assembly or Māori lawmaking structure of some kind that doesn't get admitted into the governor's presence and returns and says, okay, we'll do it on our own now. And that's when, he throws his weight behind the idea of, I guess, a Māori kingship. So there's that evolution, which is a response, obviously, to context. And also those ideas as well, I think, have an independent power. What was the other thing I was going to say? I think that was the main point. Of course, some people would not acknowledge that the kingitanga is not alive and well. I mean, it still is alive and well, and it might be fulfilling a slightly different function to what it fulfilled in 1860, but it still exists. It's still going strong.
Kia ora, Peter, for that question. Just thinking in terms of more modern times in regards to Mātike Mai and the creation of those models, all based on Whatarangi Winiata's thinking of creating an upper house and houses, and of course the Anglican Church itself had its entire constitution shifted along the basis of that same vision. Now we can argue about whether or not it's actually achieved what the vision actually was, but certainly this idea of creating a structure for decision making. Certainly Māori have been looking at that for a long time. Whether or not there can be the political currency to ever affect that at a national level is another question.
Kia ora. Kia ora tātai. Kia ora māmai. Ki te atu I tō kanuri kei te uri ngā mahara ki ngā wā o moe mahen koe te tahia Martin Dawson. Look, I'm really interested in your reference to incrementalism and transformation, and whether you are suggesting that they are mutually exclusive, or whether one can or does lead to the other. The other question that is in my mind is the issue of consensus, and where does that sit in relation to that incrementalism and transformation, and the extent to which that has application to the purpose and intent of the Treaty of Waitangi, of the treaty. Ai.
Kia ora. Nui te roa te wā, tēnā koe. Incrementalism and transformation was the words that were used at the conference, and it was said specifically we don't need to be mutually exclusive here, but the way in which the kōrero developed was it was very much a sense that there's a slight shift between the two, and some difficulty with coming across from one waka to the next, so there may, but I don't think it's irredeemable. I don't think that needs to be unbroachable. And I was thinking, one thing I hadn't mentioned, there's lots of things I hadn't mentioned, but if there's something that the last 2 years have taught us, that Maori actions on the ground with regards to the COVID response, for example, and iwi and hapu, getting our people vaccinated, this concept of the public good, and there were many different ways that people worked to achieve that. So, incrementalism and transformation manifest in community action. These things are not a million miles away from each other. In terms of consent, consensus. I don't know how to answer that. Can you just clarify the question a little bit, or maybe I'm just a bit...
Yeah, I guess my lens on this really is probably influenced by my role as a chief political advisor.
Kia ora.
And that those kinds of tensions that you're talking about are almost omnipresent.
Yeah.
In that political environment. And when you're dealing with, issues like co-governance, like the establishment of the Maori Health Authority, and you're getting these kind of very polarised political positions on those kinds of developments. So, when I think about incrementalism and transformation, my years of having worked in the Māori development space, that, patience and persistence, has characterised it, and that we get enduring outcomes as a consequence of that patience and persistence.
And not necessarily consensus.
And not necessarily consensus, So, so that's kind of really where my whakaaro is kind of coming from, and I suppose I'm trying to search around to see whether there's something in this intellectual discourse that is useful to the kind of work that myself and others are involved in terms of that space.
Yeah, I think mechanisms to affect consensus, you tend to end up with the ratification processes and things like that, voting processes, and we all know that there are mandate issues, and that mechanisms to affect consent don't necessarily show the existence of consent. It's what people do on the ground to determine whether those outcomes are met slowly and patiently over time. I don't know if there are, I'll be interested to have more kōrero about that and what consensus, I keep saying consent, but consensus, what that looks like.
Yeah, and I guess my other whakaaro comes from tikanga Māori, because I know, growing up as a child, that the kawa, was about no tahi, kōrero tahi, moi tahi, kai tahi. Doing it together in order to achieve consensual outcome.
Yeah, well, ko te hui tērā. So that's why hui are so important, and those assemblies are so important, because the boil gets lanced regardless of whether or not there's actually consensus. There is kōrero, and that can then lead to action. So not necessarily requiring exactly consensus, but process. The right process matters. Yeah, kia ora. I don't know if that helps at all.
Any other questions?
I've got. Oh no, someone else. Go.
What I'd like to do, just because we're in a few minutes, Alice, I'd like you to ask you a question, and then Ned.
No, where you go, Ned? No. Go on.
The question from Maori, and fabulous papers, both of you, thank you. Maori, you've written about the Crown, is it Pākehā? And I wondered whether you could say something about that, and maybe also what the transformationalist perspective on that is.
Before you answer, are there other questions? I'll just keep them now and then let's ask a question. So you ask a question.
I suppose with the mention of the assemblies and linking that in with both security and also the Declaration of Independence, whether actually adhering to and following obligations there would mean actually undertaking a process to enable a return to those assemblies.
Ned, what was it again?
The Crown is not visible.
Oh yes, that's Joe Williams's fault. He wrote that in the Reo Māori report, and he said that, I'm paraphrasing, the Crown is also Māori, and this has to be realised if we're going to make any progress. And so really he was talking about the survival of the reo. He's saying the Crown also needs to speak Māori. And so the transformationalists are very suspicious. I mean, I'm not wanting to put people in boxes, but just picking up on the kōrero from a few days ago, are very suspicious of the Crown speaking Māori and taking those concepts, inserting Māori in legislation, for example. There was a proposal that all Māori words be taken out of legislation. That Māori words have been in legislation for decades now. It's probably a bit too late. As Joe would say, and I've heard him say it, the horse is bolted. But it's a real challenge, this notion of the Crown also being Māori and speaking Māori, and I don't think we haven't really had that debate yet, but it's provocative. And do you want to take the other one?
Maybe I can combine answer to both questions. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, to go back to the sort of political anthropology or ethnography I was trying to paint, that there's a question over to what extent the Kawanatanga incorporates the rangatiratanga of iwi hapu, and so that could be, maybe that's related to Joe Williams' comment about the Crown becoming. The Crown is not just Pākehā, it has to incorporate, it has to be legitimate, it has to incorporate rangatiratanga. I don't know how this relates to, and so that could look like Parliament. I mean, and it has been incorporated in terms of assemblies. Even the settler Parliament had Māori seats from 1867, which was a poor reflection of population and so on. But and so over time there's been those sorts of adjustments. But yeah, I just wonder with this. I'm just wondering aloud now. I'd be interested. The idea of co-governance. Is that a case of rangatiratanga saying we want more power within the sphere of Kawanatanga, or is it more like a partnership model, between the two? I don't know. There's different Venn diagrams you could draw, right? But I think it's an important question, because if and again I'm just thinking out loud some thoughts I've had recently. If it's the first one, which is that rangatiratanga has been incorporated more within the structures of Kawanatanga at the centre, to use my analogy, how does that relate to the strong traditions within Kawanatanga of sort of one person, one vote, democratic citizenship? And so that's, I think, where you get that conflict and that tension between, maybe this is a consensus question too, about how do you get consensus on these sorts of transformations, within the sphere of the Crown or the Kawanatanga, and that tension between authority that's tribally sourced, sourced in rangatiratanga, and authority that's sourced in the body politic as a whole. The citizenship, sort of in Article 3. So I guess it's, in a sense, it's maybe a tension between Article 2 and Article 3.
Depends on how you translate articles.
Well, yes, and as well. But anyway, that's just some thoughts on those.
Yeah. Just a final point about the organisations and possibility of constituting assemblies. That was tried in the 19th century with the district runanga, which was a failed experiment. And also, there's always a risk when you kind of involve the Crown in the creating of groups like that, is there's co-option of the process. So there has to be something, that has to come from Māori communities, not from the Crown.